Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Transportation Security will come to order. Before I do my statement, I'd like to note for the fact that I used to practice in this courtroom for about 16 years, and it's really nice to be back here. It's important that we're having this hearing here today, and this is the closest I'll ever come to be having a gavel in this building ever again, I think. But regardless, I do want to make a statement for the record, and I will begin with the subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the security measures, communications, and response at our nation's airports. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. If security at our nation's airports was flawless, there would be no need for today's hearing. But the fact of the matter is that our nation's airports are far from flawless as far as security goes. The subcommittee is convening this field hearing today to assess the state of security preparedness among our nation's airports. Today, we will hear the critically important perspective of the individuals who face security challenges on the front line each and every day in New York State and elsewhere throughout our country. The American people expect the best from the entities entrusted with their safety. It is this subcommittee's intention to continue working tirelessly to ensure the security of the traveling public. I am humbled and honored to have the opportunity both to represent people of Central New York and to chair this critically important subcommittee. In my 10 months in office, I have worked vigorously to address known challenges that the Department of Homeland Security faces. Since January, I've introduced 7 pieces of legislation that address transportation and border security issues, 2 of which are already public law. As you can tell from this committee, security is not a partisan issue, and I am proud of the work that I've done with my Democratic colleagues to tackle this critically important issue. However, my colleagues and I have a lot more work to do, and I promise we will continue to provide diligent oversight of Homeland Security. When we see a problem with this agency, we work swiftly to address it. 2 years ago, there was a tragic shooting at Los Angeles International Airport where Gerardo Hernandez, a transportation security officer, lost his life, and 2 other TSA employees and 1 member of the traveling public were injured. This shooting and other incidents force us to face the grim reality that airports remain a target for terrorists and other violent actors who seek to disrupt the safe travel of the American public and challenge the security of our nation's transportation systems. This is of serious concern. Last month, President Obama signed the Gerardo Hernandez Airport Security Act of 2015 into law. I introduced this piece of bipartisan legislation because it specifically addresses the ways in which the airport community and the TSA prepare for, respond to, and communicate during major security incidents such as active shooters. And I will note also that I had a wonderful conversation with Gerardo Hernandez's widow after the fact, and she was very excited that the bill was passed, and she was excited that it honored her husband, but she was more excited that it was going to do something about security at airports across this nation. She's a good woman. From the LAX shooting to the machete attack earlier this year on a TSA employee in New Orleans, we know that there's a dire need for airports to effectively ready themselves for a wide range of security scenarios. In this regard, TSA must be proactive in proliferating best practices for security across the airport community to ensure the well-being of both the agency's own employees and the traveling public. While each airport is unique, it is imperative that airport stakeholders, airlines, law enforcement, emergency first responders, and TSA work together to exercise plans and improve coordination among relevant entities. So far, in the 114th Congress, our subcommittee has conducted rigorous oversight of airport access controls at airports across this country. The issue goes hand in hand with the overall security of the airport environment as we work to mitigate insider threats and close security loopholes. Our witnesses today conduct and experience daily airport operations and are best prepared to inform Congress as to how they work to enhance security incident preparedness. Long before the terror attacks of September 11, 2001, the Syracuse community was made all too aware of the critical need for a secure transportation system. On December 21st of 1988, a bomb detonated aboard Pan Am Flight 103 traveling from London to New York. 35 of the bombing victims were Syracuse University students who were traveling home for the holidays after spending a semester abroad. Another one of the individuals on board was a very good friend of mine's sister. Rick Hartoonian is the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of New York. His sister was a student at Oswego State University, and she was also lost on that flight. So to say that it's hit home is an understatement. Since that tragic event, there has been a litany of attacks and plots against both commercial aviation and airports. This reality highlights the need for congressional oversight for each aspect of the transportation system, including the physical security and preparedness of airports themselves. There is an ongoing discussion between the airport community and TSA about the future of airport exit lane staffing. As many airports begin to adopt technological solutions like Syracuse has, I'm interested in a better understanding of the effectiveness of such technologies and the benefit they provide to both TSA and the airports. I will note that Syracuse has an automated exit lane. That means that there's no guards there as mandated after 9/11 because the exit lanes are completely automated. And we want to examine the efficacy of trying to expand that nationwide and whether that's better security than having 3 or 4 individuals there. And there's also a cost-saving measure involved in that as well. Additionally, airport perimeter security, which my colleague is vitally interested in, and employee access controls remain critical in ensuring that secure and sensitive areas of airports are only accessed by vetted and authorized individuals. Today, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about their perspectives on the security posture of our airports and how they are working to stay ahead of a changing threat landscape while coordinating across federal, state, and local jurisdictions to ensure safety of the traveling public. Syracuse Airport is on the cutting edge of leveraging technology to address security vulnerabilities. I look forward to hearing how Syracuse Airport and other airports throughout New York State are utilizing innovative tactics to enhance security. In closing, I urge both of our witnesses to let us know how Congress can help you both fulfill your critical missions. And I would appreciate a very candid discussion, and don't be afraid of, I won't go into prosecutor mode on you, I promise, okay? Although it's tempting in this courtroom. I thank both of our witnesses for their time, and I appreciate the opportunity we all have today to hear how best practices can be shared and refined to ensure the security and safety of our nation's aviation system. With that, I now recognize a gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, for any statement he may have, and I want to thank him for making the effort to come here before coming with me down to Washington to serve down in Washington this week. So, Mr. Keating.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us this morning. Every week I fly between my home in Massachusetts and my office in D.C., and I'm well aware that our airports face unique and challenging times, themselves, and the personnel that are there do a fine job working, trying to keep us safe. In fact, it wasn't long ago that the chairman of the full committee, Chairman McCall, and I led a field hearing at Logan International Airport. That was in 2011 to discuss both individual and shared concerns expressed by airport operators, employees, and, of course, passengers. It's with this perspective that I carefully observe the security and layouts of our airports as I visit them. And as I left Boston and arrived in Syracuse this morning, I noted the differences between the two from size and staffing. This morning's hearing provides us with an opportunity to continue the ongoing discussion over critical security, communications, and response needs to our airports outside of the walls of the committee hearing room. Led by Chairman Katko and the subcommittee's ranking member, Congressman Rice, our subcommittee has followed tragedy and triumphs at airports from Atlanta to New York to Los Angeles. Today we find ourselves in Syracuse, where we have an opportunity to hear from two sides of the multifaceted aviation security equation. Ms. Mayola, the Regional Director of TSA Region 1, and Mr. Martel, the President of New York Aviation Management Association. Again, thank you for being here. No conversation surrounding airport security can continue without thorough discussion of the tragedy at Los Angeles International Airport nearly 2 years ago. On November 1st, 2013, a gunman entered LAX with a semi-automatic rifle, ammunition, and the specific intent to harm transportation safety officers. He opened fire on Transportation Security Officer Gerardo Hernandez in the action of diligently checking passenger boarding passes, and doing this important function, he was killed in cold blood. He then proceeded into the sterile area of the airport where he shot and injured 2 transportation security officers, James Spear and Tony Grigsby. The Los Angeles World Airport Police Department, along with numerous emergency responders, acted quickly and bravely to subdue the shooter, who injured at least 6 innocent bystanders. Were it not for their valiant actions, further loss of life there may have been catastrophic. If there's one silver lining in such an inexplicable tragedy, it's the increased knowledge and understanding we have of our threats, our vulnerabilities, as well as our capacity to respond. In the aftermath of the LAX shooting, we learned that there was much to be done in terms of preparedness for and response to active shooter and other emergency situations that may arise at our nation's airport. Through reviews last Congress, for instance, we learned that not all the panic buttons and red phones utilized at checkpoints were functioning properly, and real challenges existed relating to the interoperability of communications for first responders. I cannot underscore the importance that law enforcement agencies be able to communicate with each other, emergency care providers, the airport, and TSA in real time. How else can they ensure that responses to an emergency situation are comprehensive? And how else will those entities coordinate a response with one another? Since the LAX shooting, we've learned that other vulnerabilities pervade aviation security efforts. Of particular interest to me is the risk posed by the airport's perimeter. This spring, the Associated Press revealed that there have been at least 268 perimeter security breaches at 31 major U.S. airports. And TSA has calculated a total of over 1,300 perimeter security breaches at 450 domestic airports from 2001 to 2011. This figure includes an incident near and dear to my heart when Delvonte Tisdale, a teenager from North Carolina, snuck onto the tarmac at Charlotte Douglas International Airport and perished when an airplane on which he was stowed away dropped its wheels for a landing. But that figure does not account for continued perimeter security breaches since 2011, including stowaways. Stowaways that trespassed across tarmacs, scaled perimeter fences, and drove vehicles through barriers across the airport property. As I've often said, we're lucky that these individuals did not harbor nefarious intentions. But that doesn't mitigate the risk posed by such behavior to airports, employees, and of course the passengers and travelers who rely on TSA officers and airport operators for their security. The LAX incident revealed yet another discrepancy in our respect for this first line of defense. TSO Hernandez lost his life doing his job protecting our nation's aviation passengers. However, as TSOs are not considered law enforcement officers under federal law, his family was not initially entitled to death benefits. Through leadership on this subcommittee and our full committee, we're able to extend those benefits to his family through work with our appropriations last Congress. But other TSOs still do not receive death benefits. Congresswoman Brownlee of California has introduced legislation, the Honoring Our Fallen TSA Officers Act, to rectify this discrepancy, and I hope that all will give the measure serious consideration. I myself am proud to be a co-sponsor of this legislation. Further, the Gerardo Hernandez Airport Security Act of 2015, as the chairman mentioned, recently became public law. Now TSA, DHS are directed to work with airports to develop and verify individualized plans to respond to security incidents, as well as share best practices, and that's very important among airports. Further, at a recent hearing with TSA Administrator Neffinger, I confirmed that TSA is currently conducting a top-to-bottom review of our nation's airport security needs. I look forward to hearing from Ms. Maiola about how the Gerardo Hernandez Airport Security Act and comprehensive internal review will make airports more secure and better prepared for emergency situations in the future. I also look forward to the testimony of Jeremy Martell of the New York Aviation Management Association regarding changes to security plans and sharing of best practices amongst New York airports. It's our shared responsibility to mitigate, if not prevent, tragic shootings like at LAX or perimeter breaches like those in San Jose, San Francisco, and Charlotte from occurring in the future. And I want to reiterate the importance of the work done by the transportation security officers, as they are working on the front lines every day to keep us safe. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for convening this hearing, and I look forward to a productive dialogue, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. And I want to note that Mr. Keating has been at the forefront of arguing about beefing up perimeter security at airports nationwide, and his work in that area is much appreciated. His work on the committee with me and the other colleagues is much appreciated as well. We are pleased to have two distinguished witnesses before us today to speak on this important topic. Let me remind the witnesses that their entire written statements will appear in the record. Our first witness is Mr. Jeremy Martell, who serves as president of New York State Aviation Management Association. Mr. Martell has over 24 years of aviation experience in both civil and military aviation operations. Mr. Martell served as a Secretary of Security and Operations Manager at Albany International Airport and served in New York Air National Guard as a member of the 109th Airlift Wing. We thank you for your military service, and I say that as a father whose son is just embarking on the beginning of his military service. The chair now recognizes Mr. Martell to testify, but before I do, I want to note for the record that Mr. Martell was a last-minute substitution. We very much appreciate him dropping everything to come here. He was not notified until Thursday evening of the substitution. The substitution came about due to the fact that we had originally scheduled Christine Callahan from the Syracuse Airport to testify, to shed light on some of the good things that are going on at Syracuse Airport and to learn from some of those good things. We got word from the mayor's office that she was not allowed to testify, apparently for some litigation reasons, so we appreciate Mr. Martell for stepping in when he did. So thank you very much, Mr. Martell, and your testimony, please.
Thank you. Good morning, Ranking Member Keating and Chairman Katko. On behalf of the New York State's public and private use airports, I would like to thank you for inviting me to participate in today's field hearing on examining critical measures, communications, and responses at our nation's airport. The New York Aviation Management Association, referred to as NYAMA, is to promote the viability and business interests of New York State's airports. NYAMA represents over 13,000 members and affiliate members, 120 commercial service and general aviation airports, fixed-based operators, consultants, engineers, and aviation professionals at the state and regional levels. Airports are economic engines fueling growth in the communities they serve. According to a 2010 study by the New York State Department of Transportation, the aviation industry contributes over $50 billion in annual economic activity in New York State, and almost 400,000 state residents work in aviation or aviation-related industries. The economic benefit of New York State airports are impressive. As a whole, aviation generates $18 billion in payroll and $4.5 billion in state and local tax revenue annually. However, the efficacy of this powerful economic engine and its benefits to the New York State citizens is threatened by a critical funding for our airports and their security programs. Airport security is an essential function of how airports operate. The TSA and airport staff process millions of passengers, thousands of airport employees, and tons of cargo safely and efficiently all year round. This is done primarily through the cooperation of private businesses such as the airlines, vendors, concessions, air cargo operators, and other agencies such as the airport operators, TSA, and local law enforcement. It is because of this cooperation that our airports are some of the safest in the world. The TSA serves a two-part role in airport security. First, they are responsible for the screening of passengers and their belongings. Second, they are the regulatory authority over all airport security functions. The airport operator must develop and maintain an airport security program in accordance with Code of Federal Regulation Part 1542. This program describes the means in which airports will carry out security functions such as employee credentialing, fingerprinting, criminal history background checks, security training, fence lines, perimeter security, airport terminal access control systems, camera systems, and vehicle checkpoint inspections. In addition, airports are required to provide law enforcement services to support their ASP and the TSA passenger checkpoint. All of these functions come at a high expense, which airports must bear with little or no federal funding. Airports are considered high-value targets for those who wish to do us harm. The latest challenge in the battle to secure our nation's airports is to identify and eliminate what is referred to as the airport employee insider threat. One way our airports is addressing this is through the TSA's newly created My Airport initiative, which is an awareness program designed to target airport employees and instruct them on the appropriate actions to take if they observe any employees acting in a suspicious manner. This program was initially launched with a short 5-minute video clip explaining the initiative, and the TSA is encouraging airports to promote this new campaign directed at the insider threat. One of NIAMO's member airports decided to incorporate the TSA's My Airport into its security training classes to teach employees how to identify and report these insider threats. This airport has also teamed with local law enforcement, which has created an informational poster that has been placed in the work areas of airport employees. These posters encourage employees to report any suspicious behavior anonymously to airport security. This effort shows how airports, local law enforcement, and the TSA can work together to increase awareness concerning airport security threats and take the steps to mitigate these potential problems before they happen. NIAMA strongly supports active shooter planning and training. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, one of our members, operates 6 metropolitan New York airports. When I inquired about their active shooter program, they stated that their airport's law enforcement officers have partnered with TSA and other first responders to hold drills at each of their airports. They also use TSA and Homeland Security training videos to train airport staff and recommended procedures for active shooter incidents: run, hide, flight, etc., etc. The Port Authority's Assistant Director of Aviation Security and Technology indicated that the TSA's resources are very limited for training and educational aids like posters or handouts on active shooters. They have posters on their website that airports can reproduce at their own expense, and the Port Authority has in fact spent its own funds for this purpose. In recent years, the TSA has engaged airports, requiring them to increase the airport's participation in security screening and for products entering the sterile and secured areas of the airport. Currently, airports are required to conduct random and cursory inspections on all employees. The TSA has begun to ask if airports are willing to do more, much more. This increase has overloaded airports, which is generally funded through state grants and federal grants. Adding more duties is a difficult task to accomplish. There could be a point in the future where the screening of all employees and products entering the sterile and secured areas of the airport will become a requirement. This will place a demand on the staffing and facilities like no other. Before such a mandate could be initiated, federal funding assistance would be needed to available to reimburse airports for these costs. The funding of airport security improvements for equipment and facilities has always been a challenge for airports. Shortly after the end of World War II, the federal government embarked on a grants and aid program to units of state and local governments to promote the development of a system of airports to meet the nation's needs. This program, known as the Federal Aid Airport Program, was authorized by the Federal Airport Act of 1946 and received its funding from the General Fund of the U.S. Treasury. Since then, this program has been amended several times, most recently with the passage of the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012. Funds obligated for the Airport Improvement Program are drawn upon from the Airport and Airway Trust Fund, which is supported by user fees, fuel taxes, and other similar revenue sources. A lot of things have changed since 1946. The aging infrastructure of today's airports have required the allocation of the large majority of airport fund to go directly to immediate safety needs, such as those associated with runways, taxiways, safety areas, and aircraft parking aprons. Airport security, while just as important, in many cases takes second place to these highly visible safety improvement projects. One of the ways to combat this would be to create the dedicated funding source similar to the current FAA Airport Improvement Program in order to assist airports in funding security improvements or TSA mandates. This could be accomplished through carving out special funding sources through passenger facility charge program or the security fee charges through airline ticket purchases. To give some perspective to the significant costs associated with airport security improvements, I would like to provide the following local example. In May of 2013, the Syracuse Hancock International Airport completed construction on a passenger terminal security and access improvement project. This $60 million project, which is currently being paid for through the collection of passenger facility charges, was designed to bring the both physical screening of passengers and baggage in alignment with current day security requirements. And it has also allowed for expansion and implementation for future screening requirements. The new centralized security checkpoint has improved passenger and baggage screening at several levels. New security screening equipment, including advanced baggage imaging technology, implementation of TSA PreCheck, improved customer service by consolidating TSA resources into one centralized location, and the ability to implement new security requirements, such as requirement to screen all concession employees. While programs like this are not typical, extensive financial resources had to be obligated in order for this project to occur. Most airports would see the other critical projects go unfunded as a result of such reprioritization of resources. In the meantime, for the next several years, a portion of the airport's PFC funds will go to pay for this required project rather than addressing other needs. Having a national program that could prioritize needs similar to the AIP program with oversight and ranking by priority might give airports more flexibility to focus on operational needs. Technology in the airport security has its own set of challenges. Just like your home computer and other personal electronic equipment, airport security technology has a limited lifespan. This technological obsolescence, where a product is no longer technologically superior to another similar product, requires airports to be constantly planning for the next major upgrade or replacement of these very important systems. For example, access control from public area to the security area of most airports is strictly managed through the use of computer-controlled access systems using card reader and a personal identification number. These systems have the capability to enable or disable their own security badges if it is stolen or an employee leaves the airport employment. All access can be immediately revoked. The second layer of this system is the closed-circuit television system, which is an integral part of every airport security system. Both of these types of systems have improved substantially over the course of the past decade. Unfortunately, the costs associated with keeping the technology on the cutting edge, and in some cases, keeping them functioning, takes significant operational and capital investment. Another technological advancement at the Syracuse Airport is the Syracuse Airport is using are referred to as automated exit portals. Following the completion of the centralized security checkpoint, the airport reconfigured previous checkpoints at each concourse as the exits for passengers leaving the sterile area. The airport then installed automated exit portals at these locations. The automated exit portals allowed passengers and employees to exit the sterile area safely, while the same time preventing people from accessing the sterile area. The portals provide a positive barrier to security breaches by preventing people and things from entering or accessing the sterile area from the non-secured area. In addition to the safety and security benefits of the exit portals, the cost savings are such that the portals have paid for themselves. Because the exit portals are automated, the airport is no longer required to physically monitor the exit lanes, thus eliminating the human error element. In addition to Syracuse, these exit portals are located at airports in Atlantic City, St. Peter's, Clearwater, and the installation is scheduled to begin this November at JFK. The Gerardo Hernandez Airport Security Act. The individual incidents and detection of new security threats at airports will many times result in increased scrutiny of many and the mandates on airports on the part of the TSA. Sometimes events lead to congressional actions. The Gerardo Hernandez Airport Security Act represents one such response by Congress that seeks to improve security incident preparedness by directing TSA to verify that airports across the United States have incorporated procedures for responding to active shooters, targeting security checkpoints into their existing incident plans. Additionally, the legislation directs the administrator of TSA to report the appropriate congressional committees' findings regarding the level of preparedness at airports. The new federal law also requires the agency certify to the appropriate congressional committees that all screening personnel have participated in training for active shooter scenarios. Another feature of the legislation requires TSA to conduct a review of interoperability communications capabilities of law enforcement and TSA to conduct a review of these communications. These are all important tasks, and it is appropriate in most cases that Congress exercise oversight over TSA and airport security efforts. Compliance by both TSA and airports with these mandates will necessitate the cooperation and coordination among all stakeholders and recognition that new rules and requirements for new technologies will impose additional costs on an already financially burdened airport system. NYEMA is well-positioned to actively participate in this process and represent New York's airports and related industries in an effort to make the nation's aviation facilities the safest and most secure in the world against hostile threats. We stand ready to assist you, the Congress, and the TSA in this important endeavor as we go forward. I'm available to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martell. We appreciate you being here today, and we appreciate your testimony. Our second witness is Ms. Marissa Maiola. Did I say that correctly?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Who currently serves as the Regional Director of Region 1 at the Transportation Security Administration, including New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Maine. Ms. Maiola has served this post since January of 2012. In addition, Ms. Maiola currently serves as a Federal Security Director at JFK International Airport. I'm interested in hearing about the exit lane issue there as well. Previously, Ms. Maiola served as a Federal Security Director at LaGuardia International Airport, and we recognize you to testify, and I want to ask you if you can, try and keep it as close to 5 minutes as you can and just summarize your testimony. We'll have plenty of time to get into the details as we go on. Thank you.
Yes. Good morning, Chairman Katko and Congressman Keaton. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss airport security operations. Providing security for the traveling public and workplace safety for the Transportation Security Administration workforce are our highest priorities. On November 1st, 2013, Transportation Security Officer Gerardo Hernandez was shot and killed at his post at Los Angeles International Airport. Officer Hernandez had worked for the TSA since 2010 and left behind a wife and 2 children. Behavioral Detection Officer Tony Grigsby, Security Training Inspector James Spear, and a passenger were also wounded in the shooting. On March 21st, 2015, Supervisory TSO Carol Rochelle was attacked by an assailant with a machete at the Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport. Officer Rochelle was gazed with a bullet as a Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Department deputy fired shots during the attack. The assailant also sprayed wasp repellent at 3 of our TSA officers. While our officers showed bravery and commitment in the face of great tragedy, these incidents demonstrate an alarming trend of lone wolf individuals bent on harming our nation's transportation system and the TSA workforce. Following the events of LAX, then Administrator John Pistol convened a working group to address vulnerabilities highlighted during the incident. The group included representatives from law enforcement agencies and associations, labor groups and industry associations, TSA employees, and other federal, state, and local agencies. One of these discussions, TSA conducted a national review focused on training and communications, emergency response equipment and technology, and law enforcement officer present at checkpoints and response to emergencies. I would like to address each of these issues. The Los Angeles and New Orleans incident raised concern about the adequacy of training for our TSA employees responding to emergency scenarios such as the active shooter. Following the review, TSA made active shooter training mandatory for our workforce on an annual basis and created our own training video specifically focused on airport environment. We also regularly conducted mandatory emergency response training, tabletop exercises, and evacuation drills for our TSA personnel at airports, along with our airport and law enforcement partners. Through daily shift briefings and internal communications, we have made officer safety a reoccurring theme at TSA's communication to our frontline employees, engaging our officers on the importance of remaining vigilant and alert, reinforcing access control measures, and reporting suspicious activity. Regarding emergency response equipment and technology, our review indicated that many airports needed improvements to their alert notification systems, such as ensuring that duress alarms are present on all screening locations. In response, TSA procured 5,500 additional duress alarms. We also conducted a survey and found that 98% of the existing alarms were fully functional. We took corrective action to fix the remaining alarms, and TSA employees are now required to conduct weekly tests on the alert systems. As part of our review, TSA also studied law enforcement presence at airports. TSA requires all airports to either post a law enforcement officer at the screening checkpoint or incorporate maximum law enforcement response times in their airport security plan, or ASP. TSA conducted a thorough review of all ASPs to ensure these requirements were appropriately documented. These response times can vary by airport to ensure they are both practical and appropriate, as we recognize the importance of allowing discretion in these determinations. However, ensuring that all airports adopt clearly articulated maximum response times in their ASP is critical. TSA continues to monitor and enforce airport compliance with the response times defined in their respective ASPs. Additionally, TSA has issued recommended standards for increased law enforcement presence during peak travel times at checkpoints and high-traffic lobby areas, such as ticket counters, to provide visible deterrence and faster response times. We support this effort through a partial reimbursement agreement program that assists airports with payment toward dedicated law enforcement officers working in and around the passenger screening checkpoints during operational hours. We have strongly encouraged airports to adopt these measures. The tragic shooting of Officer Hernandez and the attack of Officer Rochelle were horrifying and heartrending. TSA has taken a series of positive steps to prevent such tragedies from occurring again. I want to thank the subcommittee for your support as we seek additional ways to improve officer safety and security and airport security generally. TSA greatly appreciates the support of Congress in these endeavors, and we value the committee's direction through the Gerardo Hernandez Airport Security Act of 2015, which codifies many of the lessons we learned in our after-action report following the LAX shooting and enables us to continue that work. TSA has been coordinating extensively with the aviation and surface stakeholders on active shooter drills, emergency response planning and training, and we look forward to that continued effort. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Maiola. I ask unanimous consent to insert a letter I have sent to Administrator Neffinger from the Transportation Security Administration into the record. The letter focuses on defensive tactics trainings, and I just want to enter that into record at this time. It inquires about defensive tactics training for transportation security officers at airports nationwide. And without objection, so ordered. In consultation with the minority, we've decided to do a more loosely defined hearing here today. We sometimes have as many as 30 people at a hearing, and sometimes as little as 2. But down in Washington, it's more formal in how we proceed. But here, since there's only definitely going to be 2 of us today, we're going to relax the standards a bit, and we're going to do about 10 minutes of questioning by myself, followed by 10 minutes of questioning by Mr. Keating, and we'll go back and forth until you're either sick of us or we're sick of you. How's that sound, all right? And I now recognize myself for 10 minutes of questions. And Ms. Maiola, I want to start with you because I appreciate your testimony and in a summary form, but I want to kind of drill down a little farther into security preparedness at the airports. And it's been an evolution as I understand it. The Gerardo Hernandez incident a couple of years ago exposed a gaping problem with security preparedness. And so I want to know what's happened since then, if in a summary form, and then if you can after that, kind of tell us what's on the horizon, given the fact that the Gerardo Hernandez bill is now law.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Katko. Lots of lessons learned following the LAX shooting, and of course the safety of our officers and the traveling public is paramount. After the LAX shootings, TSA convened a working group, and they examined the incident and identified areas that needed improvement. And the areas that needed improvement were training, emergency response equipment, as well as law enforcement presence. So the training that TSA has been involved in over the last year, we've completed active shooter training on well over 55,224 employees. And it's a yearly training, a mandatory training. And within that training, TSA created a video with run, hide, and flight, which are some of the tactics that we've trained our officers to utilize during a active shooter scenario. As far as the emergency response technology, we did recognize that the most immediate and quickest way for our officers to ask or to get help, especially during an imminent threat, is to have duress alarms. And we have been installing duress alarms at our airports, and it's a work in progress. We've completed most airports. Presently, if we don't have any new technology in place, each airport does have either a panic button or a phone, a direct line to the Port Authority. I'm sorry, I'm speaking for JFK, but directly to the Airport Authority. And we do test our alert notification system weekly to ensure that it is working. Also, as far as law enforcement presence, we have required that the airports put into their airport security program a maximum response time. For the most part, that's normally 5 minutes or less. So those are some of the things that we are doing since the LAX shooting. And sir, on behalf of TSA, we do want to thank the subcommittee for passing the Gerardo Hernandez bill. We have a working group that has convened that is looking at the provisions of the law, and they will be helping us to identify what needs to be carried out with the law. In particular, the bill does talk about or requires TSA to disseminate best practices to our stakeholders, but it also it requires for the airports and for TSA to work with the airports to have individualized incident response plans at their airports.
Thank you. I want to follow up on a few of those things. As far as the emergency response, you said there's you've responded with respect to technology and duress alarms, and you said that was a work in progress. What do you mean by that when you say work in progress?
So specifically for them within my region, I am working with the Port Authority for JFK as well as Newark. So those airports do have means in place. We are working with the contractor and hope to have complete installation of the new duress alarms by this November.
Now, with regarding the active shooter training scenarios, you said that you touch about 55,000 workers and you do it by video training, and what other type of training do you do to assist with the active shooter situation?
So we work very closely with our law enforcement partners. So specifically for our officers, they do have this training video, but we also exercise it. We conduct exercises at our checkpoints. I could speak specifically for JFK. Again, working closely with the Port Authority. The Port Authority built a state-of-the-art checkpoint, if you will, and mock ticket counter in one of our buildings, Building 208, where the Port Authority Police, along with Port Authority Office of Emergency and Management, we have several times throughout the year, we invite our TSOs as well as our behavioral detection officers, along with the police and the law enforcement community, and we conduct active shooter drills at mock checkpoints, similar to an airport environment. So we do that firsthand. Not all airports are doing that, but we do have a requirement to have tabletop drills and active shooter drills, as well as at our checkpoints, we conduct quarterly breach drills with our officers.
Now, the Port Authority, I would expect, is always going to have their antenna up high with respect to terrorist activities, because we all know New York City is a high priority target for international terrorists. But, with the phenomena developing that these lone wolf situations, whether they're fueled over the internet by an ISIS type of group or just some sort of hate group nationwide that's of domestic terrorism type, there is more of a possibility that airports outside of New York City are going to be high-value targets. Do you have any sense for what type of stuff they're doing in those airports outside of the New York City area? And do we need to do more at those airports to beef up the active shooter scenarios and training?
Yes, so it's not just exclusive to New York. All airports are required to conduct active shooter training.
How often do they have to do it?
It's a yearly requirement for our officers, but as far as the law enforcement community, they are continually working together with TSA as well as other law enforcement agencies to carry out some of the training that they may have learned. But more importantly, TSA did distribute over 500 copies of threat mitigation active shooter training to our airport partners, where the airport partners brief not only their own employees, but the entire airport community on active shooter.
Okay. Now, Mr. Martell, could you give us your perspective from, obviously you're at a different airport and you are head of the upstate, or the New York State Association. How do you see the active shooter and emergency response programs at the airports that you oversee?
Well, last year we have an annual conference where we bring airports across the state together to talk about issues, and typically what we would do is we'll go to the host airport and conduct an activity there geared to bringing directors and airport managers to talk about issues. We conducted last year, September of 2014, Syracuse Airport hosted the conference, and the Syracuse staff conducted an active shooter training, and where they utilized the the emergency operations center, brought first responders, airport law enforcement, TSA, all the groups together, and went through a scenario and activated their emergency operations center. And so for us, it's more of an education and training and supporting our member airports. And I think the airports are really on the cutting edge when it comes to this type of training and working with our partners, with the TSA and local law enforcement, because this is such a serious subject.
Okay. Thank you. And I just, what I want to ask both of you just briefly is there more that you could be doing if you had the resources that Congress could help you with? And as far as active shooter and emergency response is concerned? You better say yes, right? You know you gotta-
Absolutely. As most of my testimony was regarding funding, funding is absolutely critical. Putting those dollars where will support the TSA and their mission and help airports backfill some of the areas that they see as being critical to these types of programs is critical. So any funding that can be put towards preventing these types of actions is definitely helpful.
Ms. Maiola?
Yes, and thank you, sir. Congress has been incredibly supportive, especially following the LAX and New Orleans incidents. Specifically, any policy presently do not require, TSA is not looking for anything, but of course funding is always on the table, where we can always use more funding to help support some of the resources that we have at our airports.
Okay, switching gears a little bit here. The training you have is trying to detect and respond to an active shooter situation, but you know, and these incidents also point up a problem with respect to TSA officers at airports. At least they're unarmed, and they don't have the ability really to defend themselves in a traditional way through weaponry. So you have to rely on other security support that's at the airports. But this letter that I sent to Homeland Security today, to Neffinger, that I've referenced a few moments ago, has to do with defensive tactics. And I'm concerned that it doesn't seem to be enough training going on, if any training at all, with respect to how TSO officers are to protect themselves and defend themselves if they're engaged in an active shooter situation or an assault type setting. So if you could, Ms. Maiola, if you could talk about that, and Mr. Martell, if you can add anything, please do so.
I can't speak specifically on the defensive tactics, but I can speak with regard to the active shooter. So you may have heard, Congressman, Chairman Katko, that just following the New Orleans incident and what occurred there, Officer Rochelle did state that some of the tactics they used to defend themselves did come directly from the training that they had received with the run, hide, and fight, where they actually used a suitcase to push the passenger away. So our goal is safety of our officers. There are other things that we have done with regard to the incidents at LAX, and one of those does have to do with police officer presence. And the officers, law enforcement officers, have been very supportive, especially after LAX, where they do perform some patrols in and around our checkpoints. We also have our Viper teams, our FAMs, Federal Air Marshals have Viper teams at the airports, where they are also patrolling our ticket counters and checkpoint areas. We also do receive, additional support from other law enforcement within the airport, such as CBP and the National Guard, if they're posted at specific airports, where they also provide visibility, especially during peak times.
Thank you very much. Mr. Martell?
Dedicated law enforcement at security checkpoints is something that not all airports are doing, but a lot of airports have been voluntarily placing LEOs at security checkpoints landside, which is where the passengers come up to the checkpoint. Syracuse Airport, I know for a fact, is doing that, and that program has been well received. Once again, it's a funding issue. You're taking resources from other locations, but the airport feels that it's something that definitely needs to, is important and is part of a overall larger program. But arming the TSA security screeners or anything of that nature, I can't comment on because I don't have enough information on it.
Well, thank you. I could go on for a lot longer, but I am going to try and stick to a somewhat of a schedule here and yield my time for Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great opportunity for me to see here in New York how things compare to what I'm most familiar with in the Boston region. But I did notice coming through these automated, exit lanes, how new technology can be helpful. But, under the regulations, statutory and regulatory language that currently exist, there's some ambiguity about who's going to be in charge of the staffing, who's going to be responsible for the costs. And this can be a great problem. For instance, if this were going to be retrofitted in another airport, and they had to do configurations, remodeling, changing the terminal, some of the interpretation is that once you do that, you're totally responsible. And they're going along the lines, at least temporarily, my understanding, of still funding the cost of the exit lane personnel from TSA and not imposing that on the airports. It's something our subcommittee has worked to try and not make a result of these interpretations, because all these airports are different. You've got small airports, municipal airports, authorities. It runs the whole gamut. And putting the cost and responsibility on these airports, who aren't doing, frankly, enough now, is a problem. So, first of all, Mr. Martell, from your perspective, how do you deal with these lack of interpretations, or what happens if you are trying to ultimately go to this, but in doing so, you're triggering all kinds of costs to yourselves? To me, if it's this, I've said it before at hearings with TSA's top officials and with Homeland officials. If this is going to be required and it's that important, TSA should be responsible for it and not leave it in the hands of, the airport organization. So if you could comment on that problem. Are you seeing that ambiguity? Is it something that airports can absorb? What are you seeing here?
It's difficult for airports to absorb that because it does require additional staff, and historically that's not a function that the airport has undertaken. I can speak to the exit portals at Syracuse Airport. There are numbers associated with it. They've got eight portals. Total equipment and vendor installation was about $623,000. And the cost to put the infrastructure to accommodate those was approximately $180,000. So it was a significant investment up front. While the portals do take up significant resources from an infrastructure standpoint, the cost to man without the portals is about $300,000 a year for an ASO and about $550,000 a year for an LEO. So you can recoup those costs over a period of time. There's obviously right now there's no paying for maintenance and the operation of.
So you're doing the airports absorbing this cost for these new.
Yes, the Syracuse Airport is absorbing the cost for the maintenance and operation of those.
And don't you think that would be a huge deterrent to other airports going forward, the expense of this?
It could be if it wasn't, if there were a grant or something available to help the airports do the initial installation, that would be very helpful.
And what about the remodeling that goes with it? I mean, maybe this was easy to configure here, but it could
Right.
be significant because you have wide open spaces that you'd have to reconfigure, build walls, and the expense could be enormous. So if you're trying to move to this, and they're absorbing the cost, especially the medium and smaller sized airports, where are they going to get the funds for this?
That's a point well taken. In my testimony, I did talk about a $60 million improvement that the Syracuse Airport underwent in recent time here. They were planning for this. So if you've got an airport that needs to be reconfigured, it could be a significant cost. It could
Yeah.
be millions of dollars to reconfigure the terminal.
So it won't happen, even if it might be helpful. The other thing I want to mention too is, you mentioned, cameras in airports, and you're looking to remodel that. I assume you're absorbing some of that cost too, or is TSA?
What I'm familiar with, federal and state funding is generally used for a lot of the security.
And who oversees it to make sure the camera's in the right place, or?
Well, I would hope that airports would work with our partners, with law enforcement and the TSA, but there isn't a guarantee that.
Because I want to tell you that I referenced in my opening remarks a 16-year-old that secreted himself on the airwell of a commercial airliner, a major airliner that was going from Charlotte Douglas to Boston, and how he was only discovered after the landing gear went down over the town of Milton, and his body was found, where he had frozen to death. We went back, I was the DA at the time, we went back with our police to investigate that, since it was a death. And we found out that the cameras didn't even pick his coming up through the perimeter, didn't pick his even being near the airplane. And nothing was detected with the existing cameras that were there, which is even more amazing. So not that a 16-year-old boy did this and went in, but also that after knowing he did it, nothing ever showed up that he was ever there. And to me, when you're talking about cameras, that's just not within the terminal, but it should be outside, around the perimeter, certainly around the areas where the planes are, so that can be detected. Is that being done here? Do you have outside cameras? Are you in response, or could the same problem occur here?
At Syracuse Airport, they do have external cameras, and the systems become antiquated very quickly. I do know that they're looking at trying to secure investment once again for a state grant program to help support putting in additional cameras, especially out on the aircraft parking aprons, which would assist and help with detecting. But there again, you've got to have somebody on the other side of the camera sitting in a room and trying and making sure.
Well, the overall, we use a process a joint vulnerability assessment that's being done, looking at all the issues outside and inside of airports. But I must tell you, and just again for the record, that when that young man died, they were doing about joint vulnerability assessments of 17%, I believe, of all the airports. Only 17%, despite the numbers I said in my opening remarks. And now it's down to 3%. So it's going the other way. So if you're looking at improving security don't you think, Ms. Maioli, that what is your experience here? I mean, are you like the norm, 3% of all the airports in your region where you're looking at? I mean, how can we judge the vulnerability on a piecemeal basis? And how can we do it with a decrease in these kind of assessments?
Thank you, Congressman, and that's a great question. So my job as a federal security director is to ensure that no one gets onto the air operations area. It's not only my job for TSA, but it's an airport community initiative where everyone is involved in it. So presently what we do at many airports, and this goes across our nation, but we have a very robust compliance team of inspectors that are out there every day. I could speak firsthand for JFK. I have well over 50 inspectors that are out there on a daily basis, looking at perimeter, looking at cargo, catering, etc. We also, specifically at JFK, we have roving patrols, where the Port Authority did contract a company that works 24/7 just looking at our perimeter.
Yeah.
We have well over...
I must agree with you. JFK is one of the best and most secure airports. Yet, a man a few years ago was just jet skiing,
Yes,
and he
yes,
got in an accident, and he just went right up on the runway
yes.
to the planes. It's a tough balance, too. The other pressures we're hearing from airports is the speed getting through the airports, because of you weigh the risk versus what you have to do to expedite people. It's a tough equation. But there's been a decrease in that expediting that's occurred, the kind that did for people that go through what would amount to the TSA preferred lanes. And we're hearing from, at least I hear in Logan Airport in Boston, that's been a problem. So number one, if you could just quickly address what, if anything's happening there. Number two, very specifically, I'm curious here in your region, if you're having the same problems, I think you're getting more resources, frankly, in this regard, for international flights. We're reporting an hour and a half delays in screening on international flights in our area. And we're trying to deal with this, and U.S. Customs and Border Patrol issues, resources are tight, but, and they helped in our region with kiosks, additional kiosks. Yet, we even have the airport saying, we'll pay for the overtime for Customs and Border people to try and alleviate this. Yet they're not allowed to do it. Are there statutory or regulatory roadblocks to that? What can we do when we have an airport that's willing to give more of their own resources to move people along and help customers, but they have a roadblock in doing that? Is there something we can do?
So, Congressman, TSA has just spent the last 7 months looking at effectiveness, security effectiveness, and that balance with the efficiency and the wait times. We trained all of our officers in mission essential threat mitigation training. It was either a 10 or an 8-hour block for each officer. And what we are seeing at the checkpoint is an officer that's more diligent and screening one passenger, one bag at a time, looking or identifying the threat. So we are seeing that. What we are seeing, and especially having had a very busy peak summer, we saw tremendous growth across our system, 5 or 7% increase in growth.
Yes.
And of course may have attributed to additional wait times. But we do have, as you may be aware, our administrator made a policy decision to cease Managed Inclusion 2. So all airports have ceased utilizing the Managed Inclusion 2. And we do also resort heavily on our other layers of security, such as our BDOs, our law enforcement partners, and also our canine that are out there that help mitigate some of the potential vulnerabilities or threat prior to the checkpoint.
So, but the real issue I had too, the specific one drilling down, is even when you have airports willing to take that cost and you have existing personnel, why are there still roadblocks to allowing more, especially on the international flights, the Customs and Border Patrol people to be there? Is it regulatory too, or is it statutory? Do you know?
I think I would have to defer that to Customs because it could be statutory on their end. But it has, from a TSA perspective, we have nothing to do with the Customs side of that wait times.
And the dogs are helping on the TSA side.
Absolutely.
Move people through. But there still has been a delay here too because you're doing away with some of the other procedures. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very tough balance to get people through and to keep us secure. But I want to thank you for taking the time to be here, and we'll continue in this committee to try and be helpful on both fronts to try and deal with expediting people in and out, but also in making people more secure. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. I want to follow up on some things he was asking with respect to the exit lanes and get kind of some of the nuts and bolts of it, because it's an issue that I'm wrestling with, and I see how it works here in Syracuse because we have automated exit lanes, and it seems to be at best a very minor inconvenience or no inconvenience at all. Some people complain that you're standing there for 3 seconds as opposed to 1 or something. So if that's the biggest inconvenience you have, that's not so bad. But I want to, first of all, I guess we'll start with Mr. Martell. How many airports under your jurisdiction as head of the New York State Association has the automated exit lanes? Is Syracuse the only one?
Right now, Syracuse plus with JFK would make 2 that I'm aware of.
Is there any other airports in the upstate region, at least Buffalo, Rochester, as major airports, that are looking into the automated exit lanes?
None that I'm aware of at this point. I do know that when Ms. Callahan has the opportunity to talk to other airports, we do discuss that. and the benefits of that type of program. But right now, I'm not aware of any.
What are some of the benefits you talked about?
Staffing certainly is a big one. That's is one of the key issues. Certainly, staffing and the reliability of the checkpoints or the exit portals themselves. They don't take breaks. They don't take. They're there 24/7, and the ability for implements or anything to enter the sterile area from the non-secured area is minimized. So, I mean, you take the human error, that human element out of it, and to help people exit in an efficient manner is a benefit to it.
Now, and I'll ask you the same question in a moment, but before I get to that, given the fact that there's been studies done at anywhere from $85 to $90 million a year could be saved manpower expenses for just people standing there monitoring the exit lane, and you're taking away the human error capability. Is there any, based on those facts, is there any discussion that people are trying to go towards the automated exit lanes, or is there still a question of whether you can afford the upfront cost to make it work?
I think everything's on the table at this point. I mean, technology is definitely something that our member airports are interested in. They're interested in the upfront costs is certainly something that could potentially put a roadblock. So any funding that could be secured to help support that would certainly be welcome. But this is something that I do know that airports are very interested in.
Okay. Ms. Maiola?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Congressman. And TSA has looked at technology, and we work with airports interested in investing in the technology as an alternative to having our employees staff these lanes. So more specifically, TSA, we don't have that funding mechanism in place to pay for this type of technology. So we do rely on our airports, our partners, to fund some of the enhanced security projects that are out there. As far as the role, we work together. I mean, everyone's part of the detect, deter, and prevent, but we do rely heavily on our airports to fund those type of technologies.
So that's part of the problem. Now, since I'm with you right now, I'll ask you, and I'm going to ask Mr. Martell the same question. If expenses, costs associated with initially going to exit lanes, automated exit lanes, weren't an issue, which would you prefer based on your expertise? Would you think it's better to have the automated exit lanes, or just keep them the way they are now?
So what works in one airport may not necessarily work in another airport. There are differences. There was
You sound like a politician saying that.
Well, I do want to, I actually was privy coming to Syracuse yesterday, last night landing, and I went through the portal. It's wonderful. And I thought to myself, wow, JFK, some of the proposals, nothing is definitive, but the plan would be Terminal 4 at JFK, which is our biggest international terminal, is looking at this portal. But I had said, what would that look like at a JFK? The 3 seconds, 5 seconds that it takes for an individual to get into these portals, that processing time could be pretty detrimental at a larger airport, because you will literally have lines that may go back all the way to the gate. So I was looking at that difference in the balance. So if no cost was involved, if it eliminates the human factor, knowing that you have a great piece of technology like this, of course, TSA would have to look at what works at each airport, because not all the airports are the same. And we do not want to impede on the operation either, or slow down the process.
Okay, Mr. Martell?
Putting on my airport manager's hat, I would say anytime that we can cut down staffing costs and add some technology that would decrease errors and allow for more efficient screening of people, I would say I would support that. And I think that as the technology gets better, certainly it'll become more accessible by airports, but there again, it's a funding issue, infrastructure. Some airports aren't designed in the same manner. If you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. So making sure that the infrastructure is there and the ability for airports to actually work around that infrastructure and install these will be critical. But I would support something like that, I think.
In my previous life as a federal prosecutor, I often had the opportunity to travel abroad and train prosecutors all over the globe. And I was always struck, especially in the European countries, that their technology generally was much better than ours. as far as these types of things go. And the airport, have you been to the airport in Munich by any chance? It's unbelievable. It's high tech, and they had all automated exit lanes, and they seem to work wonderfully. So it just seems to me that if you have a chance for $1 billion of savings, close to $1 billion of savings over a 10-year period, if you automate exit lanes, it seems to me we can find a way to help you finance it if that's the way to go. Now, the problem is you have some of these old airports like National Airport and JFK and LaGuardia. They're kind of like old hospitals. There's corridors everywhere, there's rooms everywhere. It's not necessarily the best laid out place. It just keeps being built as capacity dictates. But as a general rule, it seems to me that if we can somehow find a way to pay for this stuff, it might actually make sense in the long run. And I don't think you have to cut jobs. You can simply move people from one area to another as attrition happens and do it that way. So I'm not talking about eliminating jobs, I'm just talking about better utilizing the workforce and planning going forward. And with the technology the way it is now, anything we can do to stop these issues. Now, I'll just note quickly, when I'm leaving National Airport, I get off the plane and I come out Terminal 35, and it's like a zoo. And then I walk out, and there's anywhere from 3 to 4 law enforcement people sitting at desks, playing solitaire on a computer or whatever, just kind of standing there and watching people walk by to leave. And it just, to me, seems incredibly wasteful. And as we progress with our goal to make airports as secure as possible, we ought to keep that in mind. So, and with that, I'll yield back to my colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go back on the Customs and Border Patrol issue with Mr. Martell. Maybe that might be a better venue for the question. Are you aware of any airports, I'm familiar with Boston, willing to have the cost of the overtime funded by themselves just to expedite that hour and a half wait that exists? And if you're not aware, would you think that would be something that you would see a utility of from the airport side if that's a problem there?
I'm not aware of any situation that has come into play, but certainly if an airport has that funding available and they're willing to do that, that might be something that could be entertained. But I think as far as the Customs and Border Patrol situation is concerned, I can't speak to that specifically because I'm not familiar with the
maybe
situation.
in part because your area is getting extra Customs and Border people funded, and that's something that if an airport wanted to go ahead. So we'll follow that up on both fronts, not as much with TSA, but with Customs and Border people. I want to see, in terms of best practices and some of the things that were mentioned, where do we stand right now with upgrades in communication so that airport officials and TSA officials and local law enforcement can all communicate with each other in real time? Both of you, if you could answer that, that'd be helpful.
I think this is still a significant challenge with the interoperability of equipment. The technology from my previous life at Albany Airport, we had various systems that were patchworked together, and one had a digital system, another agency had a different kind of analog system. I think those challenges still exist. Things are getting better between law enforcement agencies as old equipment becomes obsolete. I believe that all the partners in the security for an airport are getting together and discussing how they can make their systems interoperable, and communication between local law enforcement, the TSA, and the airport sponsor together. That's always important, and I do know that that's something that many airports are working on currently.
Yeah, my recollection of the 9/11 Commission study, when they dealt with World Trade Center bombings, or the airplanes actually crashing into the World Trade Centers, was that if they had more viable first responder coordination back and forth, there's not one other factor that they could identify that would have saved more lives in that process of reacting to that. So wouldn't you think that would be a priority, Ms. Mayola, of all the things that we're doing, making sure they can all communicate real time?
Absolutely, and Congressman, that's one of the reasons why we did aggressively install the duress alarms to ensure that that communication between a truly life and death situation, where it's imminent and they reach out directly to the law enforcement officers to respond. That's one of those things that I couldn't agree with you more, sir.
Yeah, and the radio communication that's necessary, though, following that up would be,
Yeah, the inoperability of communications is always, and it's definitely a government-wide challenge. But we also, one of the things that we did do in light of the LAX incident was any TSA employee phone that's issued has been uploaded with airport contact information, where there's immediate contact information uploaded into every device, as well as we can only encourage employees with their personal phones to do the same. So we do provide guidance out there to the workforce. We are constantly communicating with them about their well-being, see something, say something, vigilance, protecting yourself.
is there still a need to upgrade that coordination with first responders and airport and TSA officials? Is there still a necessary upgrade of that has to occur
I think
for
we can-
real-time communication, other than the alarm saying this is, come here, basically, but?
There's always room for improvement, and that's one of the things that we are looking forward to in the Gerardo-Hernandez Act. As I mentioned earlier with Congressman Katko, we have a working group that's convening, looking at the law so we can carry out the provisions in the law, but part of that does discuss the incident response, where every airport will have to individualize their plans to ensure that we have communications, which is going to be included within that response plan.
Because one reason I ask here is because if there's any place in the country where there's an ability to do that, given the resources and training of the first responders in the New York area, as well as, in the airports, it's here. And if it's not up to speed here, my conclusion would be it's not up to speed anywhere, the way that it should be. So I'm curious, as this happens, if you could contact the committee and tell us what upgrades you're doing, how that first responder communication's going. Not every airport is the same as the airports here, yet if you could do it here, we could do it in the smaller and medium airports as well. And it's probably, in many of the smaller airports, more necessary than any place else. In terms of deterrent issues and, the VIPER program, and you could take a minute to probably explain it better than I can. The budget for that's been decreased $23 million, and the budget for fiscal year 16, another $3.1 million decreases in place for elimination of 2 VIPER teams. And they're deployed not only in aviation facilities, but also surface sector areas where I think in our country, bus, trains, and other surface transportation, we haven't had the threats actually occur the way they have in Europe, for instance, but there's reason to believe they might be forthcoming. What's your reaction to the cuts in this area? Should it be a concern? Should it be something we should look at in Congress and make sure we're funding?
Well, from a TSA perspective, the president did sign that law, so there were cuts and funding was taken away. The VIPER, which is the visible intermodal prevention and response, it's really...
Notice I had you say that.
I like saying VIPER. It's a lot easier, but we do have that in place where, yes, the resources were cut, but we have limited resources at our airports, but we do utilize, as I mentioned earlier, whether it's our federal air marshals, we bring in law enforcement at those airports, officers, BDOs, to be on this VIPER team. So I understand the cuts, and of course, if there was any way to have more funding to increase some of the VIPER activity, of course, my own personal opinion, I would support it.
Great. Mr. Martell, are they valuable to the airports? Have you found them to be? those
I'm
teams?
sorry, I'm not familiar with the Viper teams, but I mean, we had rapid intervention teams that we used. It was only geared towards aviation, and to cut that program, we found them very useful, and I wouldn't see a need to cut a program unless it was found it wouldn't be useful in certain respects, but I can't really comment on the Viper teams.
Great, well, thank you, and I yield my time back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The last thing I want to touch on before I wrap up my portion of the testimony is on our access controls. And as you know, I've introduced a bill that hopefully will be voted on in November about access controls in airports. The bill that I introduced was precipitated by a number of acts that have occurred over the last few years at airports nationwide. The most poignant one of which was a gentleman that was caught coming off the plane from Atlanta to LaGuardia with a backpack full of guns. And he had either 14 or 15 guns, maybe as many as 17, 9mm guns and 2 assault rifles, most of which were loaded. And it turns out this gentleman had made about 10 trips of similar amounts in the past. And he had an airport employee from Delta Airlines in Atlanta who had simply walked a bag through the non-secure area from the non-secure area of the airport into the secure area of the airport using his SIDA badge, and just handed him the bag, and the guy got on a plane and went up to New York and sold them. Of course, the possibilities of something to go wrong are incalculable, and the tragedies that could have resulted were amazing, but it really pointed up this lack of security at airports. And then you look at, some of TSA's responses included the Viper team. And then, you hear more recent incidents like the drug trafficking ring that was disrupted at LAX and Dallas-Fort Worth, where they were simply talking to each other, the employees, about where the Viper teams were in the secure areas of the airport, and they were just going through other doors that weren't secure and bringing the drugs into the airports. And you overlay that with the fact that one of the individuals that came up at his preliminary hearing was offering to bring anything to the employee access doors, including bombs. And that, to me, is frightening. And, we have an obligation to try and beef up security. Now, you look at all that and say, well, let's make them secure. Let's let them go through just like what travelers have to go through. And the way these airports have been designed, and we talked about it earlier, how they kind of have been expanded in sometimes a hodgepodge manner to meet demand, there's a lot of access points. Some airports have as many as a couple hundred access points. Some have a lot less. Atlanta's going from 64 access points. They're trying to get down to 4. They're trying to go to 100% screening. There's only a few airports in the country that can do 100% screening. But I just, we've developed testimony about that, but as long as you're here, I just wanted to get your take on it. Each of you is what your concerns are with respect to access controls. And, you've got a very good perspective, both of you, because you have small airports that you oversee and you have influence on. And then you have the big mamas in New York City. You have LaGuardia and Kennedy. So you have everything. And I understand the practical problems with trying to secure all the access points. But God forbid we don't do everything we possibly can and something happens. Because when you have close to 1 million airport employees nationwide, you just need one bad guy. And if you think about it, what's going on now in the country with respect to ISIS and how people are getting radicalized over the internet from afar, and someone is having a bad time in their life, and then they get this thing, you can get everybody back by blowing up something or putting a bomb on a plane or whatever. It's really kind of scary. And for people to be offering to take bombs on planes, kind of scary stuff. So with that heavy overlay, I'd just like to get your take on the access control bill, and, or more importantly, what we can do to beef up the access controls and what's realistic. And either one of you can start because it's a real fun topic, I'm sure, for you two.
So, Congressman, aside from the logistical and the costs involved in conducting 100% employee screening, the individuals that work at the airport are vetted and are trusted population. Sort of contradicts what you just mentioned with some of the examples that you provided. But we do have a system in place with access control, with identification, that, of course, we can close down access immediately, especially if one of the ID badges are lost or stolen. But we also have to have our workers trust their fellow workers. and basically with the individuals that they are working with every day, practice challenge procedures, see something, say something. We have increased some of our playbook activity at some of these access points. The airports and Syracuse has done a great job as far as reducing access points, whether it's a small airport or large airport. We are making every attempt and effort to mitigate as much as we can, where we're forcing individuals or employees to either utilize a checkpoint where there's some sort of screening, or going through limited doors where we have visibility there, whether it's Vipers, Playbook, law enforcement, where there's some sort of additional screening done at those doors.
Access control is definitely something that's, from a financial perspective and a facility perspective, is very significant. The screening of all airport employees can take, if you have an initial push in the early morning, you're screening thousands of employees arriving at some airports, arriving in the morning. The insider threat is a big thing, teaching people that if you see somebody coming in who's not scheduled to work with a backpack full of whatever, say something about it and tell somebody that something doesn't look right. So we rely on the airport employees to do a lot of the internal part of security. And the practicality of screening everybody right now is that it really isn't practical, even though that's not a good way to look at it, just because of the sheer nature of the way things are laid out in an airport environment. I think screening product is definitely something that needs to occur. You can screen employees, but you're also going to need to screen product. There's product that goes into the sterile area of airports out in the secured area that may not be screened, and it's just as easy for somebody to do something bad with that as well. So it's a comprehensive plan of people, product, and then airport employees being diligent out and notifying people when they see something that's not right.
Yes, and the bill that's being contemplated is that it originally came out as, prescribing what should be done at all access points. And we've heard enough of the articulation of what you've both talked about today to realize that we need to look at it more. So we're asking them to do an analysis of the costs and the type of things that make the most sense going forward. But my overall sense is that we need to do more and beef up access controls more than what we have right now. We owe it to the American public, and we got to get a handle on it, because it's a vulnerability that I had no idea existed until I got into this job. And it's sometimes tell people, if you knew what we knew, sometimes you wouldn't even get on a plane. But I understand the American public is as best served as it possibly can with the people at the airports and the security they're trying to do, but it's very, very difficult. And as air traffic increases and as air capacity increases, like it's projected to over the next couple of decades, it's our duty to make sure that we do everything we can to make sure we get in place proper security measures, both for employees and people visiting the airports. So, Mr. Keating, do you have any more questions?
No, I just apologize. The notes back and forth, a little irony here with airport management, but our flight was canceled back to D.C., so we're scrambling to try and see if we can get back.
That's payback for talking about access controls, I think. So, well, we really appreciate both of you coming up here today. We appreciate your professionalism. We appreciate your candidness. And, just so you know, when you testify, it doesn't go into a vacuum. We have a bunch of people here listening, and the staffers are far more smart than we are. And they're going to take this information, synthesize it, and we use it. So it's not just a question of putting on a show and having you come here. We take your input, and we take it very seriously, and we value it. So we appreciate it. On behalf of Mr. Keating and myself, I want to thank both of you for being here. Your testimony was great. And the members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask you to respond to those questions in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7E, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. And without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. And thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe you
Thank
can
you.
help us get it.